Welcome to the Veritas Forum, engaging university students and faculty in discussions about life's hardest questions and the relevance of Jesus Christ to all of life. For more information about the Veritas Forum, including additional recordings and a calendar of upcoming events, please visit our website at www.veritas.org. The following material is copyrighted and may not be duplicated, reproduced, or redistributed without prior written consent from the Veritas Forum. Join us as we explore true life.
The topic for the night is Science and Religion in the 21st Century. We have four distinguished panelists, and let me begin by introducing them, starting closest to me and proceeding in that direction. The first speaker will be John Kennedy. He is a professor emeritus in the Department of Chemistry here at UCSB. And after receiving his PhD from Harvard, Dr. Kennedy worked at DuPont and at General Motors, where he led a group in the development of batteries for electric automobiles. In 1967, he accepted a faculty position at UCSB, where he taught analytical chemistry for over 30 years. During those years, he also spent time in Japan, Russia, China, and India as an invited lecturer in the field of electrochemistry. He has been a mainstay of the campus Veritas program. He is the father of 5 children and 6 grandchildren. Next to Dr. Kennedy is Dr. Alvin Plantinga, the John A. O'Brien Professor of Philosophy at Notre Dame. Professor Plantinga received his MA in philosophy from the University of Michigan and PhD from Yale. Professor Plantinga's wide-ranging philosophical interests and important contributions figure perhaps most prominently in metaphysics, and the theory of knowledge, and in the philosophy of religion and philosophical theology. Besides his numerous speaking and teaching engagements, Professor Plantinga has published over 100 academic articles, as well as many books, including God and Other Minds in 1967, The Nature of Necessity in 1974, God, Freedom, and Evil, also in 1974, and in recent years, a trilogy of works in the theory of knowledge, Warrant, The Current Debate, Warrant and Proper Function, and Warranted Christian Belief. Next to Alvin Plantinga is Dr. Doug Thrower. Dr. Thrower received an MA in biology in 1987 and a PhD in molecular, cellular, and developmental biology in 1995, both of those degrees from UCSB. He completed postdoctoral assignments in the Biological Sciences Department at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and at the City of Hope National Medical Center in Duarte, California, before returning to UCSB to take the post of lecturer and research biologist in MCDB. He's published papers in the areas of anti-cancer drug pharmacology, microtubule-based molecular motors, chromatin structure, and DNA repair mechanisms. And finally, our fourth speaker, at the far end of the row, is Dr. William Lane Craig, research professor of philosophy at the Talbot School of Theology at Biola University. Professor Craig received 2 master's degrees, one in the philosophy of religion and the other in church history from Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. And he also holds 2 doctor's degrees, one in philosophy from the University of Birmingham in England, and the other in systematic theology from the University of Munich. Professor Craig's areas of particular interest and expertise include philosophy of religion, the historicity of Jesus Christ's resurrection, and the philosophy of time. In addition to publishing many academic articles and undertaking countless speaking and debating engagements, Dr. Craig is the author or editor of numerous books, including The Kalam Cosmological Argument, 1979, The Cosmological Argument from Plato to Leibniz, 1980, a book entitled Theism, Atheism, and Big Bang Cosmology, co-authored with Quentin Smith in 1993, and Naturalism, a Critique, co-edited with J.P. Moreland in 2000, and finally, God, Time, and Eternity, published in 2001. Okay. All right, let's move then directly to our first speaker, Dr. John Kennedy.
Thanks, Doug. Well, the title of this event is Science and Religion in the 21st Century. And so we will look at the relationship between these two domains and try to see where it is now and possibly where it might be headed. And there are several possible relationships that we can imagine. Let me postulate four. This is based on the writings of Ian Barber. First, we can postulate that the two domains, science and religion, are independent of each other. Science studies its things, and religion, or more generally we can say philosophy, studies its own. They both exist in the same universe, but they have no interaction with each other. Sort of like parents and their teenager living in the same house. Gould calls science and religion two non-overlapping magisteria. That sort of carries a connotation of pompous domains claiming their own territories. Astronomers measure the number of stars and determine their motions, but it's the philosopher or the theologian who makes value judgments. The night sky is beautiful is probably a simple one. An old cliche raised by cynics states, scientists can attend church, but they should check their brains at the door and pick them up when they exit. However, historically, and up to the present, we see that many scientists and other deep-thinking persons have used their intellectual gifts and have concluded that religion is a vital part of our existence. Just to cite a few examples, Newton, Pascal from earlier times, but in the present, Francis Collins, director of the Human Genome Project, and one that I'm familiar with, a noted chemist, Fritz Schaefer, who's actually lectured extensively on the many, many scientists who have believed in God as an integral part of their lives. Second, we can postulate that science and religion compete with each other for the same territory. This can lead to the idea that one actually subsumes the other, an integration. That is, one becomes just a subset of the other. Throughout earlier history, up to the Renaissance, theology and philosophy was the overarching domain and held the truth. We still have vestiges of this relationship. We chemists and physicists and biologists like Doug Throw over there all receive PhD degrees, a doctorate of philosophy. However, this relationship led to conflicts between the church and science with the work of Copernicus and Galileo in earlier times, and more recently the work of Darwin. It should be noted, though, that the work of Copernicus and Galileo really conflicted with ancient Greek philosophical ideas. The church's error was just in defending these philosophical ideas. Third, we could invert the model and say that science subsumes religion and philosophy. That is, modern science holds the truth and all other fields are a subset. And I've met some scientists who actually believe that. Fourth, we can propose that science and religion do have some overlap. They can dialogue with each other, just as we are dialoguing tonight between philosophers and scientists, and that each has something to say to the other, but they must be consistent with each other. That could mean that science may have to adjust its view of the cosmos and religion may have to also adjust its view based on the knowledge they receive from each other. That is, both domains work together to approach, but probably never reach, absolute truth or veritas. Now, why shouldn't a scientist believe in a God who created our universe? My colleagues frequently say, I don't take anything on faith. If I can't see it and measure it with some instrument and other such statements, it doesn't exist. Well, we all take things on faith. Since the number of men and women is finite, and man is finite, his knowledge is limited, it's finite, and so the total sum of mankind's knowledge now and even into the future is finite and can be put into a box that has boundaries. The question is there something outside the box that transcends us? A person may say on faith, there's nothing beyond our understanding. Another may say, there is. Both accept their beliefs on faith because they know nothing outside the box. The man of the latter faith may believe that what transcends it is a God who made the box and may even want to communicate with those of us who are inside the box. Many of you here tonight know me and are aware that I personally have this latter type of faith, a faith that has become stronger as I work through moments of doubts and questions that we all must face. At this point, we might want to invoke another idea that's used by scientists quite often, the principle Occam's razor. If confronted with two or more alternatives, like we just had here, is there something out there or not out there? Choose the simplest as a working hypothesis. Perhaps it's simpler to say there's nothing outside the box. Actually, a better expression of Occam's razor's principle is don't add a layer of complexity if you don't need to. Let me give a simple chemistry example. In the classic Millikan oil drop experiment, all the oil drops developed various charges, but they were all multiples of one value, 1.6 times 10 to the minus 19th coulombs, which is just a very small number. It was concluded that an elementary charge then was 1.6 times 10 to the minus 19 coulombs, and that the oil drops had just acquired one charge, two charges, three charges, and so on. But we could also postulate that the elementary charge was half that value, 0.8 times 10 to the minus 19th coulombs, and that oil drops always gathered in pairs. So the oil drop got 2, 4, 6, 8, and so on. The experimental results cannot distinguish between these two hypotheses. But Occam's razor principle says, why add the complexity of charges only coming in pairs unless you get some other information that would force you to that? Now, it might seem that postulating something outside the box is an unneeded addition, and that postulating nothing outside the box is a simpler hypothesis. However, the consequences, and remember the overall theme of this Veritas Forum is truth or consequences, the consequences of that hypothesis leads us to even more complicated explanations. Why does the box exist at all, and how did it come to be? Or, for example, what triggered the Big Bang? A second area where scientists balk at religion is accepting one that claims the reality of miracles. Here we have to be a little careful how we define the word miracle. In our everyday usage, I may say, oh, I came to UCSB at 10 o'clock this morning and it was a miracle that I found a parking space right next to the chemistry building. In other words, we call a low probability event as a miracle. The Chicago Cubs winning the World Series would be a miracle by that definition. However, if we define a miracle as an event where natural law has been broken, then scientists have a problem accepting this. Making the sun stand still, I suppose that means stopping the Earth's rotation for a period of time. Changing water to wine, walking on water, are miracles where natural law has apparently been broken. And this really bothers scientists. Why? Because scientists take on faith, by the way, that nature is reproducible. If two scientists carry out an experiment in exactly the same way, they will get exactly the same result every time. Of course, it doesn't always turn out that way in the laboratory because some hidden variable in the process was not known. and that is how these unknown variables are brought to light and science progresses. Scientists vigorously pursue these apparent conflicts because they have faith in the reproducibility of nature. Now, as a scientist, that bothers me, still bothers me to some extent, but one resource that has helped me dealing with this difficult issue is a book that's titled Miracles by C.S. Lewis. And though the book was written over 50 years ago, his words are still very relevant today, so I recommend that to you if you're troubling over that particular issue. So I asked my esteemed colleagues 3 questions. How do you view the relationship between science and religion in this 21st century, these 2 domains? 2, how do you explain to a scientist who has a committed faith in the reproducibility of nature to accept a religion that claims miracles? And 3, why should a scientist, or anyone for that matter, think outside the box? Thank you.
Thank you, John. I should say that the planned format this evening is this. Each of the 4 panelists will make an opening statement, and then there'll be a brief period in which the panelists can direct questions to each other and answer them. And then we'll throw open the discussion to the audience where people can ask questions of the panel at large or a particular panelist. And I will we'll repeat this at that time, but we're going to ask people who do have questions in the audience to come down and speak their questions into these 2 microphones down here. This is because the session is being taped, and we want to be sure to get the questions clearly on the tape. Okay, our next speaker is Professor Alvin Plantinga.
Thanks very much, Bill. As Bill Forgy said, I am the John A. O'Brien Professor of Philosophy at the University of Notre Dame. And the interesting fact is there's another guy who is also the John A. O'Brien Professor of Philosophy at the University of Notre Dame. So I don't know, does that violate logic to have 2 who are both the, i.e. only, Professor John A. O'Brien Professor? But we won't worry about that. We're not going to talk about logic, but about science and religion tonight. So my general topic is the relation between religion and science. And under the rubric of religion, I want to include naturalism, where naturalism is the idea that there isn't any such person as God or anything at all like God, all right? No such person as God. Also, no Hegel's absolute, no Aristotle's being that thinks only about himself, and so on. That's what naturalism is, and I don't say that naturalism really is a religion, but I do say that it plays the same role as, it plays some of the same roles as does a religion. It tells us where we come from, what's most real in this world we live in, what we can expect, if anything, after death, what our prospects are, what's most important about how things work. Naturalism gives an answer to all these questions. And so, of course, does a religion, like, say, Christianity. So naturalism plays some of the very same roles as does a religion. And I would like to argue this. What I'd like to say is there is superficial conflict but deep concord between science and Christian belief, and there is superficial concord but deep conflict between science and naturalism. So I want to say there is a science-religion conflict, but it's a conflict not between Christian belief and science, but between naturalism and science. So that's my thesis. And of course, I don't have nearly enough time to develop my thesis. I could as well just sit down right now, but I still have 7 minutes. So, last night I had my say about the second main thesis yesterday afternoon, and also this afternoon I had my say about the second main thesis, that there is deep conflict between naturalism and science. Those of you who heard me give one or the other of those talks will be very happy to hear that I don't plan to repeat everything I said then. But I'll just say this: the conflict between science and naturalism arises because there's a conflict between evolution and naturalism. And the conflict between evolution and naturalism arises because one can't sensibly accept both of those two propositions, both evolution on the one hand and naturalism on the other hand. The reason one can't accept both of those propositions together is that, and I'm going to have to vastly oversimplify here, if you believe in naturalism and evolution, then you should fail to trust your cognitive faculties. You should not think that your cognitive faculties, that is memory and perception and logic, reason, whereby you know about logic, you should not think that they actually give you the truth. But if you don't think that they actually give you the truth, then you should think that all of your beliefs are, at the very best, extremely doubtful. You should not take it, you should think that each of your beliefs is probably not true, even though you find yourself with this belief that the fact is it's probably not true. And if you think that, if you have to think that, then you also have to think the same thing about evolution and naturalism. So if you believe evolution and naturalism, you wind up in the position where the right thing to think is it's probably not true. And that's really to be in a totally, what shall we say, that's to shoot yourself in the foot. That's to be in a really miserable intellectual condition. If you think, well, yes, I do believe this, but furthermore, I don't think it's true, that doesn't really make a lot of sense, right? Okay, so there is that conflict between naturalism and science. Now, as for the conflict, the superficial conflict between Christian belief and science, I think there is a superficial conflict between Christian belief and science. And when we look for points of conflict between Christianity and science, we naturally look first at evolution. Ever since Darwin's day, there has been lots of claims to the effect that Christian belief and evolution are in conflict. Some of these claims made by Christians, nowadays very often made by non-Christians, by naturalists such as Richard Dawkins and Peter Atkins and Daniel Dennett and others. But if we take Christianity to be defined by the great creeds of the church, Catholic creeds and Protestant creeds and Orthodox creeds, if we take the Christianity to be defined on its intellectual side by the great creeds of the church, there isn't any conflict, really. There's certainly no inconsistency between Christian belief on the one hand and evolution on the other. After all, as far as the great creeds of the church go, although God created the heavens and the earth and all that they contain, including us, he might have created us by using some such process as evolution. But where we do find a real conflict, it seems to me, between Christian belief and some science, some part of science, is between Christian belief and evolutionary psychology, which is a kind of successor discipline to sociobiology. Sociobiology began maybe 30, somewhere between 25 and 30 years ago. It got into a certain kind of political trouble. It was considered not politically correct, and so it came to be called evolutionary psychology. And evolutionary psychology, the heart and soul of evolutionary psychology, is the attempt to explain our important properties or qualities or traits, the important things about us, to explain all that's most important about us in terms of our evolutionary origin back there on the plains of Serengeti, say 1 million years ago, 500,000 years ago. The idea is to explain all these important traits of ours, love in all its manifestations, love between men and women, between parents and children, love for your church, for your country, for your friends, love in all of its manifestations, for example. Interest in science and more generally interest in knowledge. Our sense of adventure, our delight in stories and poetry, our love for music, our morality, and our religion itself. The aim of evolutionary psychology is to explain all of these terms, all of these properties of ours in terms of our evolutionary origin. The idea is to show that the trait in question was adaptive as our species was evolving, and that's why we've got that particular trait. Well, now, many of the theories from this area are incompatible with Christian belief, and I don't have time to explain very many, but I'll just mention one. According to an important paper by Herbert Simon, altruism, the sort of behavior somebody like Mother Teresa engages in, altruism, which is engaging in a kind of behavior that promotes somebody else's fitness as opposed to your own, altruism has to be explained at the individual level by two processes or two features. On the one hand, by unusual teachableness or docility. Society tells you it's a good thing to be interested in the welfare of other people and so on. It tells you that altruism is a good thing on the one hand. And on the other hand, and so if you're unusually docile, you're inclined to believe that. And the other of the two mechanisms involved, he says, is limited rationality, which, not to put too fine a point on it, means stupidity. So the explanation of Mother Teresa is that she's unusually docile and a little not quite bright, you know. The elevator doesn't run all the way up to the top floor, or, well, you know some of those metaphors for not being quite bright. And I say that's incompatible with Christian belief. So there is a conflict here. Well, why do I say it's a superficial conflict? And here again, I'll have to be really brief. But for the following reason, contemporary science is constrained by what people call methodological naturalism. So the idea is that in science, as opposed to philosophy or theology or something else, in science, you can't refer to God. You can't propose some thesis, some theory that invokes or involves God or anything else supernatural. You can't do that. It's just not part of science. Okay? So then what should a Christian think about something like evolutionary psychology? And let's suppose that evolutionary psychology is in fact good science. There's lots of dispute about that, but let's suppose it really is good science. And let's suppose further that Christians are committed to a high view of science, taking science to be an important part of the image of God in us. What should Christians think about evolutionary psychology then, given that it comes to conclusions incompatible with Christian belief? What's the right way to think? Well, very briefly, the right way to think, it seems to me, is this. Insofar as contemporary science is constrained by methodological naturalism, that means that the evidence base for science, what a scientist uses in conducting an inquiry, the evidence base for science is just a part of the evidence base of a Christian. That is, the Christian has as his or her evidence base everything that's in the evidence base for science, but more, what one knows by way of being a Christian. And all that is really shown by the fact that evolutionary psychology comes to conclusions in opposition to Christian belief and assuming it to be good science, all that really follows from that is that from the point of view of just a part of a Christian's total evidential base, these other propositions, these propositions incompatible with Christian belief, are the sensible way to think. But that doesn't necessarily give me any defeater, any reason to give up on some belief, one of the beliefs which is incompatible with the results of evolutionary psychology. I'm starting to run over time. I'll just give one example here. Suppose you tell me that you saw me at the mall yesterday. Well, and suppose I remember, though, that I wasn't at the mall at all. I was off, I don't know, hiking in the beautiful hills around here, all right? Then with respect to a part of my evidential base, a part that includes your telling me that you saw me, the right thing for me to think is, I was at the mall. But that doesn't give me any reason to give up on the belief that I wasn't at the mall. After all, I remember that I wasn't at the mall. So the fact that from the point of view of a part of the Christian's evidential base, some belief is the right thing to think, which right thing to think is incompatible with another of the Christian's belief, that doesn't so far forth give the Christian a reason to doubt the other belief at all. So there is a conflict, all right, but it's a superficial conflict. Now, on the last bit, that is, that there is deep concord between Christianity, Christian belief in science. Here I can just refer you to Bill, who's going to say something about that, and I'll just endorse it in advance.
Thank you, Al. We will now hear from Dr. Doug Thrower.
All right. John Kennedy opened this discussion with some questions regarding the relationship between science and religion. I would like to address these questions from the point of view not of a philosopher, but of a working scientist. So I am not a professional philosopher of science. I don't have a book that I've written that describes my philosophy of science, but I do practice science, and so I have to think about some of these things as I do my work. I divide my time between teaching biology, both graduate and undergraduate students here at UCSB, and also supervising students who work with me in a lab setting, setting up and carrying out experiments. And in addition to being a biologist, I'm a Christian. From reading the articles that I read in the popular scientific press, just like there is a general popular press, there's also a popular scientific press where all the opinions are presented. From reading that, you might conclude that I would be spending the majority of my time dealing with how evolutionary issues impinge on my teaching, my research. But in reality, most of my time and efforts are focused on how organisms function in their present form in the here and now, and such they're not really directly impacted by the pathways that brought them into being. However, if at the next departmental seminar I were to make a statement to the effect that I had a few doubts about the naturalistic processes that by working on their own could bring life into existence or bring about the great variety of organisms that exist on the earth, I'm sure I would receive a fairly unified and vehement response, and it might come somewhat in this form. Well, there is sufficient experimental and observational evidence to explain all of the major questions regarding the origin and development of living organisms without at any stage implicating the involvement of any purposeful creative entity. So how can I justify being both a scientist and a person of faith? First of all, I believe there are topics that science can authoritatively address, while there are equally legitimate questions that are beyond the naturalistic approach. An example of the former are experiments that were done by Louis Pasteur, which dispelled the then very popular scientific belief that living organisms were being constantly spontaneously generated from non-living matter. And on the other hand, there are questions that can't be answered satisfactorily by science, and I underline the word satisfactorily. And examples of these include, is murder morally wrong? What happened 1/10,000,000th of a second before the Big Bang? Why is the entropy of the universe increasing instead of decreasing? What happens to the conscious aspect of our being, the thing that we all consider to be our true self, after we die? And what about the subject of miracles? One characteristic of being a Christian is a belief that miraculous events have occurred that are outside the realm of human understanding. And it's been sometimes stated that any person who believes in miracles would have problems doing science because he or she might attribute any unexpected experimental results to some deity or demon. I don't think this is a real problem, however, because I think that like most individuals in the 21st century, that you would agree that true miracle, and this was mentioned at the beginning, that there are certainly things that we say using the term miracle, but we don't really mean miracle in terms of something that violates natural law. But true miracles that really do in some aspect violate the natural laws, that go against the natural laws that function regularly, I don't think those happen very often. And they certainly don't seem to be happening very often now, and I don't believe over past that these have been very frequent events. And so I don't, for instance, think that it's a reasonable expectation that, for instance, God would cause all of my experiments to work correctly by some miraculous oversight. And that would be a real miracle if that happened. And I think there are reasons for that. I think that if that did happen, I would learn a lot less than if things didn't quite work the way that I expected them to every time. And I had to think through, well, why didn't this work out the way that I thought it was going to? I find that I often learn as much from the experiments that don't work out as those that do work exactly as I was expecting them to. Personally, my opinion is that the natural laws that hold our universe together and their reproducibility, and the fact that the universe hasn't disintegrated into subatomic particles during the last few minutes while I've been giving this talk, are miracles that are of equal or greater import than something like a miraculous healing. Finally, I believe the ability to think outside the box, as John Kennedy termed it, should be cultivated by all scientists, even those who don't happen to have any religious beliefs. All the major paradigm shifts that have come around have come because somebody has reinterpreted and reevaluated the facts. And one example is Darwin. Charles Darwin's theory of evolution caused a shift in thinking by providing an explanation for how organisms could change over time. And there have been experiments that have done with, say, bacteria, showing that if you take a population of bacteria and you put them on plates that contain an antibiotic that would normally kill them, that you'll see a few survivors, and if you grow those over time, you'll get more and more of those survivors as the others are killed off. And there are other examples that show that organisms can change over time to the point where you have a group of organisms that can all mate and are thus considered part of the same species, that they can, due to environmental pressures, change where some can only mate with others of a smaller group while these can mate with others of a different group. And so you could see that as a change and formation of a new species. And it's very easy to take observations like that and to extrapolate mechanisms by how entire body plans could change over time without any sort of intelligent input, just through this very random process of mutation and selection. But even some scientists that take a naturalistic view and wouldn't include any sort of outside intelligent input still have problems accepting the full range of change that's been attributed to the standard neo-Darwinian synthesis that is the doctrine of today. And in fact, there's several issues that have not, to my satisfaction, been explained by the standard theory. I don't have time to deal with all of these in detail, but there will be a question time after this, which if any of you wish to ask me about these or some of the other ideas that are floating out there, I'll be happy to try to address them. But from a biochemist, molecular biologist point of view, one area that I don't think has been fully explained is how a protein can, by the process of mutation and selection, change such that a new protein is generated that has the same overall three-dimensional structure, but a totally different function and an almost completely different primary amino acid sequence, which is, of course, designated by the DNA sequence. The problem is that according to neo-Darwinian theory, the protein must retain some function after every single mutation. If a single mutation occurs that knocks out function, then that protein or the gene that encodes it is basically going to be discarded, or if it's something essential, the organism will die. And others have noted this limitation in this strict neo-Darwinian interpretation to evolution. And one idea that's come up is the idea that genes can duplicate, and so you might end up with one copy that keeps the old function. You have another copy that can change and maybe change into something that will have a new function somewhere down the line. Gene duplication, however, carries its own problems, and I don't have time to go into that, but again, this is a question. If someone would like to address that, we can get into that later. Another area that I think is ripe for investigation is the observation of the conservation of body form over long periods of geologic time. And this has been observed by looking at fossil evidence and showing that there are many organisms whose structures have been preserved virtually unchanged over aeons. And so this suggests that in addition to being mechanisms that allow for change, and we can observe some of those, there must also be mechanisms that inhibit change, that are conservative in nature. But nobody really seems to be looking into this. Now, it may turn out that there are naturalistic explanations for both of the issues that I presented. And if so, however, it will take individuals who are willing to think outside of the box if these issues are going to be addressed. The bottom line is that whether you're a scientist or a critically thinking individual in a different discipline, it's important that you not limit your interpretation of the world to the one that just happens to be popular or has all the right people supporting it. And I have a quote that Albert Einstein wrote in a book that he entitled The Evolution of Physics. Science is not just a collection of laws, a catalog of unrelated facts. It is a creation of the human mind with its freely invented ideas and concepts. Physical theories try to form a picture of reality and to establish its connection with the wide world of sense impressions. Thus, the only justification for our mental structures is whether and in what way our theories form such a link. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Doug. The final speaker is Professor Bill Craig.
Thank you. Well, after hearing Alvin Plantinga conclude, I feel like a football player who suddenly had the ball lateral to him, and I hope that I don't fumble. During the last quarter century, a flourishing dialogue between science and religion has been going on in North America and Europe. Science and religion have discovered that they have important mutual interests and contributions to make to each other. Let me list in my time 4 ways in which science and religion are related. Number 1, religion furnishes the conceptual framework in which science can flourish. Science is not something that is natural to mankind. As Lauren Isley has emphasized, science is an invented cultural institution which requires a unique soil in which to flourish. Modern science did not arise in the Orient or in Africa, but in Western civilization. Why is this so? Isley argues that it is due to the unique contribution of the Christian faith to Western culture. The scientific enterprise is founded upon certain assumptions which cannot be proved scientifically, but which are guaranteed by the Christian worldview. For example, the laws of logic, the orderly nature of the external world, the reliability of our cognitive faculties, and the objectivity of the moral values used in science. Science couldn't even exist without these assumptions. And yet, these assumptions cannot be proved scientifically. They are philosophical assumptions, which are, interestingly, part and parcel of a Christian worldview. Thus, religion is relevant to science in that it can furnish the conceptual framework in which science can exist. More than that, the Christian religion historically did furnish the conceptual framework in which modern science was born and nurtured. Secondly, science can both falsify and verify the claims of religion. When religions make claims about the natural world, they intersect the domain of science and are, in effect, making predictions, which scientific investigation can either verify or falsify. Let me give some examples of each. First, examples of falsification. Some examples are obvious. The views of ancient Greek and Indian religions that the heavens or the world rested on the shoulders of Atlas or the back of a great turtle were easily falsified. But more subtle examples are available too. One of the most notorious was the medieval church's condemnation of Galileo for holding that the earth moves around the sun rather than vice versa. On the basis of their misinterpretation of certain Bible passages, medieval theologians denied that the earth moved, but scientific evidence falsified this hypothesis, and the church belatedly finally came to admit its mistake. Another interesting example of science's falsifying a religious view is the claim of many Eastern religions, like Hinduism and Taoism, that the world is divine and therefore eternal. The discovery during the 20th century of the expansion of the universe reveals that far from being eternal, all matter and energy, even physical space and time themselves, came into existence at a point in the finite past before which nothing existed. As Stephen Hawking says in his book, The Nature of Space and Time, almost everyone now believes that the universe and time itself had a beginning at the Big Bang. But if the universe came into being at the Big Bang, then it is temporally finite and contingent in its existence, and therefore neither eternal nor divine, as pantheistic religions had claimed. On the other hand, science can also verify religious claims. For example, one of the principal doctrines of the Judeo-Christian faith is that God created the universe out of nothing a finite time ago. The Bible begins with the words, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." The Bible thus teaches that the universe had a beginning. This teaching was repudiated both by ancient Greek philosophy and modern atheism. Then in 1929, with the discovery of the expansion of the universe, this doctrine was dramatically verified. Physicists John Barrow and Frank Tipler, speaking of the beginning of the universe, explain, at this singularity, space and time came into existence. Literally nothing existed before the singularity. So if the universe originated at such a singularity, we would truly have a creation ex nihilo, that is to say, out of nothing. Against all expectation, science thus verified this religious prediction. A second scientific verification of a religious belief is the claim of the great monotheistic faiths that the world is the product of intelligent design. Scientists originally thought that whatever the initial conditions of the universe were, eventually the universe would evolve the complex life forms we see today. But during the last 30 years or so, scientists have been stunned by the discovery of how complex and sensitive a balance of initial conditions must be given in the Big Bang in order for the universe to permit the evolution and existence of intelligent life. In various fields, discoveries have repeatedly disclosed that the existence of intelligent life depends upon an incomprehensibly delicate balance of physical constants and quantities, such that if any of these were to be altered even by a hair's breadth, the balance would be destroyed and life would not exist. In fact, the universe appears to have been fine-tuned from the moment of its inception for the production of intelligent life. Given the incomprehensible improbability of the initial conditions necessary for our existence, it is plausible that these are not the result of chance, but of design. Thus, science can falsify or verify the claims of religion. Number 3, science encounters metaphysical problems which religion can help to solve. Science has an insatiable thirst for explanation, but eventually science reaches the limits of its explanatory ability. For example, in explaining why various things in the universe exist, science ultimately confronts the question of why the universe itself exists. Notice that this need not be a question about the temporal origin of the universe. Even if space-time is beginningless and endless, we may still ask why space-time exists. Physicist David Park reflects, as to why there is space-time, that appears to be a perfectly good scientific question, but nobody knows how to answer it. Here, theology can help. Traditional theists conceive of God as a necessary being, whose non-existence is impossible, who is the creator of the contingent world of space and time. Thus, the person who believes in God has the explanatory resources to slake science's thirst for ultimate explanation. We can present this reasoning in the form of a simple argument. Premise 1, every existing thing has an explanation of its existence, either in the necessity of its own nature or in an external cause. 2, if the universe has an explanation of its existence, that explanation is God. 3, the universe is an existing thing, from which it follows, 4, therefore, the explanation of the existence of the universe is God. And finally, number 4, religion can help to adjudicate scientific theories. In cases in which two conflicting theories are empirically equivalent, so that you can't decide between them on the basis of the evidence, metaphysical concerns, including religious concerns, come into play. An excellent example is the special theory of relativity. There are two ways to interpret the mathematics of special relativity. On Einstein's interpretation, there is no absolute now in the world. Rather, what is now is relative to different observers in motion. But on Lorentz's interpretation, there is an absolute now in the world, but we just can't be sure which events in the world are happening now because motion affects our measuring instruments. These two interpretations are empirically equivalent. There is no experiment you could perform to decide between them. But I want to argue that if God exists, then Lorentz was right. Here's my argument. If God exists, then God is in time because he is really related to the temporal world. But if God is in time, then a privileged observer exists. And if a privileged observer exists, then an absolute now exists. Thus, there is an absolute now, just as Lorentz claimed. So, if God exists, a Lorentzian rather than an Einsteinian theory of relativity is correct. It's hard to imagine how religion could have any greater relevance to science than this, to show that one theory is wrong and another is right. So, in summary then, we've seen 4 different ways in which science and religion are relevant to each other. First, religion furnishes the conceptual framework in which science can flourish. Second, religion can both falsify and verify the claims of religion. Third, science encounters metaphysical problems which religion can help to solve. And four, religion can help to adjudicate rival scientific theories. And that is why, after all, the dialogue between these two disciplines is so flourishing today.
Thank you very much, Bill. We'll soon be opening the discussion for questions and comments from the audience. But first, I'd like to give the panelists an opportunity to react to what they've just heard from their colleagues. And is there anyone here that wants to amplify what they said earlier or take issue or respond in some way to what they've heard from others? And if no one wants to rise to that bait.
Well, I've got a question for John and Doug,
Okay.
if I'm rising to the bait. You both sort of suggested that there are miracles, which I certainly agree with. Jesus turned water into wine and so on, and of course the greatest miracle of all of Christ's resurrection and from the dead. And you suggested that miracles violate natural law. I'm just wondering, does one have to think of miracles as violating natural law? I guess that would depend on what you take a natural law to be, you know, what sort of a thing is a natural law. Of course, if a natural law is an exceptionless general proposition, you know, it's always the case that P, it always happens this way, well then, a natural law couldn't be violated because if it were, it wouldn't be a natural law, right? But why couldn't you think of natural laws as something like the way God usually treats the matter he's created? So then, if on a certain occasion he doesn't treat it that way, it's not really a violation of a natural law. It's just that he's not treating the stuff he's made the same way as he always does. I mean, as he usually does. Maybe on this occasion he's got some special reason to treat it a little bit differently. And then you could think natural laws weren't violated, even though you did think that there were miracles like rising from the dead and so on. What do you think of that?
Go ahead.
Yeah.
Well, for one thing, we refer to the term law, and my wife's going to law school right now, so I hear a lot about law. Yeah, let me turn this thing on here so you can hear me. But in fact, there are many different types of law, and some of these are absolute statutes that, as you alluded to, that we say they cannot be violated. But there are a lot of laws that are observational laws that we observe over a period of time that if you throw a ball up in the air, it's going to come down again. And we say that that's the law of gravity. However, in spite of many hundreds or thousands of years of observations and experiments, we still don't have a fully comprehensive view of what underlies the process of gravity, but yet because of this observation that we're confident that at least most of the time you throw that ball up, it's going to come down. But since we don't really totally understand what is behind that, it's certainly conceivable that without invoking something happening outside of the universe, that that law could cease to be for some period of time, and the ball would just continue to go up, and we would certainly be amazed at that. But it isn't necessarily that some ultimate law has been broken, but the fact that our observation base is not complete. We haven't seen all of the possibilities. So that would be one response to that.
I could make a response too, that we may not be aware, as Doug pointed out, our laws that we call laws in science are observational things that don't seem to have had any exceptions, like the second law of thermodynamics, and yet we have no proof of it, and it is just observational. But we don't know everything about this creation that we live in. We're still learning every day. And one thing that really intrigues me as an avenue that could be used here in terms of what we call miracles, it reminds me of a TV commercial where the monks are copying these documents very painstakingly, and this monk has been given the assignment to make 500 copies, and he goes back to his little room and puts it on a Xerox machine and comes back, and the other monks say, it's a miracle, you know. There's things that we might not know about today that God knows about, and that there may be, like, we could be like two-dimensional people trying to figure out a three-dimensional world. And if somebody said to these two-dimensional people, you can have a fixed area with no boundaries, they'd say, there's no way, that would be a miracle. And yet we know a surface of a sphere is that. It has a fixed area with no boundaries. You can go around and around and around, as we do today in our airplanes. So there may be things, in fact, I think in terms of the words of Jesus, of living in the Spirit, or if you had faith like a mustard seed, you could do these things. There's something that he knows. He's in touch with some other dimension. Let's just use that as an analogy. Not that I'm saying that there is another dimension, could be, but that he's in touch with something that we could be in touch with, but we don't, and we aren't. But maybe at some point we will. Maybe it's something we will only learn after we die. But it could be that there are natural laws that we see as being broken, but to God they're not being broken.
I think that the difficulty here is that you're still presupposing, however, that a miracle, if we did have a full knowledge of natural law in the relevant case, would somehow violate that natural law or would falsify it. And I suspect that this is one of the reasons why scientists seem so hostile to the idea of miracles, because the idea of breaking a law of nature smacks of breaking a civil law, sort of violating Mother Nature or something of that sort, which is very unsavory. But if we think of the laws of nature in a different way, as simply idealizations of what happens under certain sort of ideal conditions, when there are no interfering factors present, then when a miracle occurs, a law of nature isn't violated at all, because there are interfering factors in this case. So why couldn't we define miracles not as violations of the laws of nature, but as something that simply lies beyond the causal capacity of nature to produce in any certain time and place? And I think that would just get rid of this whole emotionally prejudicial language of violating laws of nature, and speak instead of simply what lies beyond the causal capacity of the natural forces that are at work at a particular time and place.
Okay. I'm not going to argue that.
Could I maybe inject another dimension here? Frequently discussion of the relation between science and religion seems to focus on issues about the natural world, the cosmos. We've heard reference to issues like, is naturalism true? Did the universe have a beginning in time? Was the universe created by a God? Has the cosmos in its current state, a state in which life is not only possible but actual, and a state which includes organisms of incredible complexity, has that come about by chance or by intelligent design? Have allegedly miraculous events actually occurred? But I've been struck, and I think everyone's been struck recently, by the fact that discussion of some of the most pressing moral issues of our time have been shaped both by religious considerations and by scientific developments. I have in mind such things as abortion, stem cell research. I just recall President Bush's agonizing during the summer of 2001 before he gave that address before the nation. Cloning, and especially attitudes towards homosexuality. And so I'd like to hear, if it isn't inappropriate, and maybe many others would like to hear too, whether any of you in your own lives and in your own intellectual development have experienced an interplay between your religious sensibilities and scientific developments which have caused a tension or a revision in your outlook on some of these moral issues, not necessarily the ones I mentioned, but any others. More bait.
More bait.
All right, I'm willing to take that one up. One of the issues that comes up in terms of cloning, the abortion debate, is what constitutes an individual. And science has redefined our ideas of what goes on. There was a time not that long ago when the idea was that an individual actually started out as a fully formed little man inside the sperm of the male, and that basically just got implanted in the uterus and turned into a baby. And no one was really sure where that came from, but presumably somehow God placed that there. And so you could go back quite a ways then in imagining where an individual started. But now as science has given us more ideas that we know physically where the components of an individual come equally from the male and female parents, and we can trace those back from generation to generation, and it becomes sort of a blur as where do you draw the line? And in fact, some scientific discoveries have been used to try to draw a line. For instance, in the cloning issue, that the idea there is a period of divisions of that embryo at a point where it can no longer divide and form two separate individuals. The idea of twins start out in identical twins as a single embryo, and then at some certain stage of divisions they split into two individuals. But if it gets beyond that point, normally that split won't occur, and you can think of that as being one individual. And so prior to that time, then it's a little bit fuzzy, and so this has been used as by some biologists as a guideline. Well, we won't do cloning experiments on any embryo that is beyond this 12-cell state, for instance. But before then, since it could potentially divide and form two separate individuals, it wasn't really one individual, so it's okay to work at that stage. And I'm very uncomfortable with that, and with the idea that I don't know, and I don't find defined specifically in Scripture that there is some point where I can definitively say this is not an individual, this is an individual. And there are certainly many references to God knowing someone while they were still in the womb. And so while I do struggle with this and with the idea that all the prospects of cloning, perhaps curing diseases, and if I had a family member who had this disease and there was the possibility that somewhere on the horizon within their lifetime that something could be discovered that might help them to live longer or live a life that was more free of pain and disease, that it would be very tempting to justify that. But as a Christian, I feel that I have to take a higher moral ground, even if sometimes it isn't convenient. But also, science has revealed things that make it perhaps more uncomfortable for some of those who would tend to take the idea, well, until a person is born, that they're not really an individual. They wouldn't survive on their own if they were suddenly removed from their mother, and so they're not really to be given the same rights as a born individual. And yet science has revealed just how early that there's evidence of brain activity and other things that we attribute to a person. And so it makes it harder and harder to say, well, that person isn't quite born yet, and so it's perfectly okay to terminate that pregnancy for any reason whatsoever. And then 1 minute after they're born, well, they're an individual now, and we can't quite get rid of them so easily. So those are some of the issues, things that I've struggled over, and science is a two-edged sword that it can reveal things that make it easier to make decisions, but in other cases it makes it perhaps even harder.
Well, I'll just add a little bit to that, and that is that I see much in the past that scientists have taken this attitude that the two domains are totally non-interacting, and science can develop things like atomic energy, but it's going to be the people who have to make the value judgments as to how you're going to use it. And so it's almost like the Pontius Pilate, we wash our hands of this thing, you can do whatever you want with it, we're just doing our scientific experiments. But I think, as Doug has pointed out, some of the issues in recent years have become so serious that we do have to dialogue. The scientists have to be very clear in helping people who do make these decisions know exactly what's going on. And so I really welcome to see more dialogue on these value judgments where science is involved, and they can't just wash their hands of it. They have to be involved with it.
No more takers then. All right, well, I guess the time has come to open the discussion to questions from the floor. And if you want to ask a question of the panel in general or a particular panelist, please come down and stand in front of one of these microphones. Yes, sir.
Good evening. I'm feel woefully inadequate to ask a question to you guys tonight. But my question is this. We were talking about miracles, and I feel as though you could almost take a sledgehammer and hit a fly on this one. I wish that you'd just take a little fly swatter, because this might be a little below your level. But as we're talking about the Bible, and we're talking about miracles, I trust that all of you believe in the resurrection of Christ. But now, when I reckon back to early days and think of the flannel board stories of 2 on 2 onto Noah's Ark, Jonah and the whale, and I'm wondering, how do you reconcile those? Do you believe, and I speak to other Christians sometimes that almost take their Bible cafeteria style. I like that miracle, I like that one, but that one, come on, please, that's a legend. How do you guys distinguish between the two? That's my question. And even going back to the beginning, sounds like many of you believe in the bang, and then all of a sudden, was there an Adam and Eve? Literally, did the snake really talk? Those are my questions.
Those are extremely difficult questions to try to deal with.
Those are not.
Part of the question really involves literary hermeneutics, the art or science of biblical interpretation. And we don't have a panelist here tonight who is an expert in, for example, Old Testament hermeneutics. And the question would be, with respect to, say, the story of Adam and Eve and the temptation in the garden that you mentioned, is this intended by the author of Genesis or of those chapters to be a sort of literal account like a police report, or is this a dramatization that can employ symbol and metaphor and literary figure and so forth? And I doubt that any of us are qualified to pronounce on that kind of an issue unless some of us have done study of these narratives in Hebrew and can answer those. So do any of you have
Well,
worked?
Bill doubts that any of us are qualified to talk about this, but I'm not going to let that stop me. It seems to me it's connected with Bill Forgey's question. I mean, Christians for a very long time, not without exception, but for the most part, thought of the universe, thought of the world as relatively young, you know, maybe 6,000, maybe 10,000, maybe somewhat older than that. Not all Christians thought that. For example, Augustine didn't. He thought the world was very old, and that in early Genesis, what was being spoken about there were more like whole eras or something like that, not specific 24-hour days. But there is all this, it seems to me, powerful evidence from sciences like geology and a whole host of other things, cosmology, astronomy, for the conclusion that the universe is a whole lot older than that. Well, what does one do then with early Genesis? The first thing to think about is just what Bill was saying, it seems to me. If God is the ultimate author of the Bible, then of course everything that God intends to teach us in the Bible is true. And I think God is the ultimate author, so I think that. But it's not always so easy to tell what it is that God does intend to teach us in a given part of the Bible.
I think one of the issues, though we haven't touched on specifically your question about was there a real Adam and Eve, that if we do put that totally in the area of a myth or an allegory, then we have the problem for the Christian of original sin. Was there individuals that where Jesus refers to Adam and Eve and their fall specifically as if they were individuals? And was he just saying this to humor the people at the time who still believed in some sort of a fairy tale or myth, or were there real individuals, maybe that didn't look quite like we would expect or picture in the Adam and Eve pictures that we see, but individuals who were capable of thought and decision and who were our descendants in the distant past. And so I personally believe there were such individuals. Exactly where they were in time, I cannot say, and I don't think that the way that Genesis is structured, that we can really interpret that it's clear there are major gaps in the lineages, and the purpose of the lineages were not to show every single father, grandfather, etc., on into the infinite past, but to give us the idea that there was this lineage and that God had, through that lineage, which provided the fall, also provided a means of escape from that fall.
And Doug, could you comment, isn't it the case that modern biology is, as I understand it, entirely consonant with the idea that all human beings have descended from an original human pair? Don't they often refer to the mother of all persons alive today as Eve? Now, in a facetious way, not as the biblical Eve, but my understanding is that every one of us that's alive on the face of this planet today are descended ultimately from the same original human female at some time in prehistory. Isn't that correct?
So, yeah, the current idea based on using what's called mitochondrial DNA sequencing, where you're looking at DNA that's found in these little structures in all cells that doesn't vary much, unlike most of the DNA in our body that varies from individual to individual. If I compared my mitochondrial DNA to yours, it would probably be exactly the same order of bases. And so, but if you look back far enough in history, you will see some slight variations. And so by doing mathematics, since you can't, of course, actually obtain DNA from someone who lived thousands or 10,000s or millions of years ago, but you can mathematically extrapolate back and say, well, if I look at all the people living today or samples of them, then at this point, assuming that these changes in DNA happen at a constant rate, and that's a big if, but assuming that that's the case, then I can say at some point in prehistory, everyone had to come from this one human female. That's basically where they can link it to, and presumably there was one human male parent responsible there. So that's the current biology view.
Does science falsify or verify the claim of religion that God created, that God, as a loving, beneficent God, created a good world? And if God, and why apparently did God create a world where animals attack, kill, and consume each other?
Yeah, thank you.
What the Scripture says is that God looked at the creation that he had made, and it was very good. But the idea that there was no animal death or suffering prior to the fall is, I think, a young creationist myth that isn't in the text at all. There's nothing in the description of the fall of man in Genesis 3 where the curses are placed on Adam and Eve for the fall that suggests that animal death is one of the curses of the fall. The man is cursed, that he will have labor and toil in bringing forth his living from the ground of the earth. The earth is cursed in the sense it'll bring forth thorns and thistles. The woman will have pain in childbearing, but there's no suggestion in Genesis 3 that animal pain and death is a result of the fall. And in Romans 5, the passage that Doug referred to, when it talks about how death entered into the human race as a result of Adam's sin, again, there's no suggestion there that that's talking about animal death. And it's not even talking, I think, about human physical death. It's talking about spiritual death. So this is one of the oddest examples, I think, of folks who claim to believe the Bible in a very literal way, but are in fact reading huge implications into the Bible that simply aren't there. They're reading things in between the lines. It may well be the case that when God looks at this ecosystem that involves predators and herbivores and all the rest, that he sees this as a beautiful whole, a beautiful system that works fantastically. And this, I think, is something that fits in very well with what science talks about with regard to the so-called Gaia hypothesis, that the Earth is like a sort of beautiful, functioning, well-balanced organism that involves kind of a recycling of the materials.
Well, I don't
and
claim to be able to design anything better, just...
just to give one little example of this, I recently saw a program on PBS about how they are introducing wolves into northern United States and Canada because the caribou herds, in the absence of these predators, are so multiplying that the caribou are eating all of the pasture, and as a result, the caribou themselves are dying off because they get disease-ridden. The aged and the diseased animals are not eaten by the predators anymore, and so disease is rampant, the food is short, and the caribou themselves are perishing because of the lack of the predators. So by introducing wolves into the ecosystem, it gets rid of the diseased and the aged, and the caribou themselves actually flourish because of the presence of these predators in the ecosystem. Now, I don't know if that's what Genesis had in mind when it said God looked and saw that it was very good, but in the Proverbs, for example, it does say things like that God gives the young lions their prey, that they roar and God provides food for them. So that would fit in with what modern science tells us about well-balanced ecosystems, that it does require all the elements of it to have a functioning biosphere, which ultimately will be a suitable place for human beings to live and flourish.
But,
I think we need to move on to another question. This gentleman over here.
Thanks. Okay, my question is for the scientists on the panel. It's, will you admit that God is a theory, which is to say that it has a probability less than 1, although maybe very close to 1?
Well, I started off by saying, thinking outside the box, that we take it on faith. There's lots of evidence, and certainly when you listen to Bill Craig's talk, if you were there today, about the evidence, the historical evidence for the actual resurrection of Christ, there was a plan put in action. I said that I take on faith that there is a God that made this box.
So your answer is no, God is not a theory.
What are you talking? Is theory a faith issue or not a faith issue? That's why I'm not quite sure your wording, the definition.
Theory is a scientific issue that we say this is a theory of the possibility of this is how reality is.
So a theory is in terms of something that can be tested by experiments. Is that what you're referring to?
Usually yes, but for the sake of this, not necessarily. Like string theory, I'm not sure if you can test that, but. So do you think that God is a theory, a possible explanation, Or are you basically 100% sure that that's how it is?
I certainly have reached the point where I think it's 100% sure, yes.
Okay, the other guy, please.
And likewise.
Okay, so you're saying it's not a theory. So I would be fine if you admitted that it is a theory. I believe it's, if you said, I think it's a theory that's probably very, very, very likely. But since you're not even saying that, that's the difference between science and religion. Science takes theories and it admits that we don't know everything and that we could be wrong. And also, I think all of you on this panel, especially the biology professor, are kind of using religion to fill in the gaps that science doesn't know. And I think that you have to accept that there are things that we don't know, and someday we may or may not know them. But I think accepting that is better than creating mythical theories to fill in the gaps. Thanks.
I have a question about a topic that's very much in the news today, where science and religion seem to collide, and that's pretty much tearing apart the Episcopal Church, and that's the subject of homosexuality. And I go to a small congregation where there's a lot of conservatives who say we need to return to the Bible truth, and I am more of a liberal. Well, I think that if Jesus were here today, he wouldn't be discriminating against a certain group of people. And I know that there are homosexual acts in lower animals. And I was wondering, has science proved that some homosexuals are born that way, or has that not happened?
You're the biologist.
All right. There have been some papers published where some scientists have looked at the human brain and have tried to see if there's some structural differences between, say, men and women, first of all, that might explain some of the differences in behavior in general of men and women. And then also looking at populations of individuals who were homosexual or who had other behavioral characteristics that would distinguish them. And so the way this was done is that they would do autopsy, because that's really the only way you can study the human brain in great detail, although there are a lot of imaging techniques that are coming about now that can be done on a living person. But these were all done, as far as I understand, on autopsy individuals. And then they would go back, so they would try to see, characterize the different regions of the brain, different size of different regions and things, and then go back and look at, find out after they did that analysis, without knowing anything about the individual, then to see if there was a correlation between the size, say, of some region of the brain and whether this person was known to be homosexual or something else. And so there were some studies that indicated that there was some biological changes, but then some other studies came out that questioned those, and this is part of the problem of science, that science is supposed to be objective and supposed to reveal truth, but so you will have sometimes one group finding one result and then another group finding something that totally contradicts that. And it is often hard to decide, well, which one is right. And so I have not heard anything recently on that to say that we now have overwhelming evidence to suggest that, yes, there is some biological basis for that. And my personal guess would be that probably in some cases there are, and in other cases there aren't, that I doubt if you are going to find some biological thing that is going to determine human behavior as complex as homosexuality versus heterosexuality in some very simple biological manner. And so that's where it seems to be at this point. And so certainly I think it becomes then something you can't simply decide by saying that, well, a person is predisposed to being heterosexual or homosexual, and therefore you can't make any value judgments over that, or you can't take environmental factors into account. But certainly it has been an issue that is dividing Christians today over whether this is one of those things in Scripture that we take as an absolute, or that we, as we've done with other things, interpret and say, well, this was something that was cultural. And so.
Sir.
Hi. I have a quick comment followed by a question. The comment is for Dr. Plantinga, and it's in your example of altruism. I think that you failed to mention the simplest explanation, and that's that a society made up of people who care for each other have a higher probability of surviving and therefore passing on their genes. And then my question is for all of you, and it's basically why, in your opinion, has no human ever observed clear evidence of the existence of God that could appease the scientific community? Or in other words, why does your God insist on being so elusive?
Well, I'd like to reply to the first little bit, and I'll leave the hard question for the rest of you guys.
Thank you.
The second little bit. What I said was that according to Simon, the explanation at the individual level for a given person as opposed to other people in a society being altruistic was these two things, docility and limited rationality. Simon does say, as you just pointed out, that it's good for a society overall in terms of its survivability that there be altruists in it, but it's not especially good for the altruists. So how do you explain the fact that Mother Teresa or other altruists do what they actually do? How does that happen? And that's his explanation in terms of those two mechanisms. As for that other question, why is God like that? I mean, I think that's a question one would have to ask God, but it's not the case that God is hidden in the sense that hardly anybody in the world knows about God. I suppose the vast majority of people in the world believe in God or something very much like God. It's not like God is hidden in the sense that, it takes a really lucky find on the part of some extremely erudite person who spends his whole life studying to come across God. Not at all. I mean, I suppose there are billions of people who have found God. Now you say, but then what about science? How come science doesn't come up with a proof for the existence of God? Maybe that's sort of like asking, how come science doesn't have a proof for the existence of other people? I mean, one old philosophical question is, how does one know really that there are other people? You see these bodies, all right, but how do you know there really is connected with such a body a thinking, feeling person? How does one know that? Well, I don't know what the answer to that is, how one knows that. I mean, I think we're just so built that we form a belief of that sort when we see bodies, when we see what we do see. But it's not a matter for science. It's not as if we could put science to this task now and say, okay, science, show us that there really are other people, or maybe that there aren't. Same way with the existence of God. It's more like the existence of other people than some scientific hypothesis that might be a good way of explaining something or other. It's not the same kind of thing. It's not, the existence of God isn't, for most people, for most of those who believe in God, a hypothesis at all, just as for me and you and most everybody else, the existence of other people isn't a hypothesis. It's not that kind of thing.
Well, I think that one of the troubling things about the question was the sort of implicit presupposition that it's the scientific community that is the judge and jury here for the question. Why should it be that God has to appease the scientific community in order for belief in his existence to be rational? Especially when you think that the scientific community also includes a great number of atheists and secularists and agnostics. There are plenty of individual scientists who find the evidence for God's existence quite convincing and compelling. And I don't see any reason to think that the entire scientific community has to be appeased, as the questioner put it. What's interesting to note is that when you look at the history of science, up until about the end of the 19th century, the vast majority of scientists were Christians. The vast majority of practicing working scientists were believers in God. So that the fact that a lot of scientists today aren't believers in God is just a result of modern secularism. It's the same sort of secularism that has infected society, Western society in general. But the percentage of scientists who believe in God, surveys show, are just about the same as the general population. Right. I've seen surveys to the effect among scientists, how many believe in a personal God who answers prayer? And the percentage is the same today that it was back in 1908, I think. and is roughly the same for the general population. So the disbelief isn't due to the fact that they're scientists, it's just secularism that has permeated our culture more today. But in the history of science, the majority of scientists were believers in God.
I don't know if it's your turn, but go ahead.
My question is for Dr. Plantinga, and I suppose I might not have the question, and I made it to your lecture the other day, so I'm sorry I didn't. But I was wondering, you mentioned a certain conflict between naturalism and evolutionary theory, I believe. Am I right about that?
Yeah.
All right, if I'm not, I'll just sit
naturalism
back
and
down.
evolution, right.
But I was wondering, since the naturalist tends to agree on the side of physical evidence, and they were shown the certain physical evidence of the theory of evolution, how would they then not, how would they then have this sort of conflict with evolutionary theory? And so I guess I'm just basically asking, what is it specifically about the naturalist that gives them this conflict with evolutionary theory?
You're basically asking me, what did I say in those two lectures? And I don't know quite what to do about that. I mean, I can try to say it really quickly. I said something like this. I said that if you believe in evolution and naturalism, then you think that the purpose or function of your cognitive faculties, memory, etc., perception, and so on, is not to provide you with true beliefs, but rather to enhance survival, to promote survival, or promote evolutionary fitness, reproductive fitness. Okay, and then when you think about the way in which belief and behavior can be related, the right thing to think from that perspective is that the probability of our cognitive faculties being reliable, given naturalism and evolution, is low. Well, if that's true, if the probability that our cognitive faculties are reliable given naturalism and evolution is low, then if you believe naturalism and evolution and you see that that probability is low, you have a defeater for the proposition that your cognitive faculties are reliable, a reason to give up the belief that your cognitive faculties are reliable. But if you have a reason to give up the belief that your cognitive faculties are reliable, then you have a reason to give up any belief produced by your cognitive faculties, including naturalism and evolution itself. So naturalism and evolution, you can't sensibly accept the two together. Naturalism and evolution, that combination shoots itself in the foot. It's self-referentially deficient. And that means that there's a conflict between the two. If you can't accept both of them together, there's a conflict between the two. That's what I said.
Thank you. Over here.
This is a kind of liberal question, meaning there's no determined participant, so it's a free, open question. In what sense, if any, does popular science, meaning technology, I suppose, biomedical, aeronautics, military, consumer electronics, kind of replace or threaten religious experience?
Religious experience, did you say?
Religious experience, yes. Christian experience, any religious experience?
I don't see a threat. Do you see a threat? I guess we don't see a threat here. Can you give an example of where it's...
Well, for example, penicillin, the invention of penicillin, we're replacing prayer. Miracles, are a fact of technology, relying on science, the scientific method, scientism. How does the fact that we live in a technological technopoly, in a sense, threaten religious experience, if at all?
Yeah, I don't think it does. I remember there's a statement by the New Testament critic Rudolf Bultmann to the effect that no one who uses the electric light or the wireless, by which he meant the radio, can believe in God. And Alvin Plantinga has commented on that. He could imagine some Bultmann during the Middle Ages saying, no one who uses the crossbow or the tallow candle can believe in God. Belief in God seems to proceed quite nicely in spite of technological advance. I think that's probably why we all were rather bewildered as to why one would see any sort of conflict here. And in terms of prayer, I can testify from experience it in Christian churches, in the community of Christian believers, that Christians will often pray for the doctors, for the technology to be effective, so that they don't seem to think of these as being in conflict, that technology or penicillin removes the need for prayer. They're often not praying for miracles in the sense of things that would be beyond the causal capacity of nature, but they pray, God, give the doctor wisdom, help him to diagnose the problem correctly, help my friend to get the right treatment. So they actually will see the technology as a God-given means by which this person might be healed and brought back to health, rather than something that's competing with God.
Agree.
Over here.
Do any of you think that Occam's razor could provide any proof for the existence of God?
Well, I'm the one who brought it up. I'm only saying that it's a principle that a lot of scientists use. If you don't have any more information, you try to start with the simplest and then work your way from there. But that doesn't mean that you've got the right answer. Many times, things are much more complicated, as we've seen in chemistry, atomic theory, and so on. That, in fact, it's interesting that the experiments that were used to prove atomic theory were all incorrect. But they were close enough to get us on the right track. And so, yes, Occam's razor is just a starting point. And so people will make that attitude of why invent a God if you don't have to, sort of thing. And yet we see many reasons, and I think that the New Testament is one of the strongest arguments that there is a God and that Jesus was the Son of God. And if you accept the historical fact of that, you've already got this evidence for God that we've been taught, that was asked about.
It seems to be important, too, to remember that when people believe in God, it's not typically as a hypothesis. It's not like they've got this various data, they're looking around for the best explanation, and they say, oh yeah, here's a good explanation. There's this all-powerful being who created the world, and furthermore, this all-powerful being is a trinity, or has two partners, so to speak. There is incarnation, atonement. That's the best explanation. That's not how it goes. I mean, that's not how people, it's possible that there are good arguments for incarnation, resurrection, and the like. It may be even good arguments for there being a trinity. Maybe so, maybe there are, but that's not, people don't typically believe these things on the basis of those arguments. It's rather, there is the internal witness of the Holy Spirit in one's heart. You find yourself, say, reading the Bible and finding it just utterly convincing. So it's not like you're looking for some kind of explanation for all the crazy things that go on in the world or what the world is like. It seems to me it's not nearly so much like that as that it's more like knowing about some other people or perception or maybe memory. It just seems right, and that fits in with very much of what's said in the Bible about, in the New Testament, for example, about how Jesus says he will send his comforter and he will instruct us in these things. There is this sort of God's teaching us these matters. It's not so much a matter of finding a hypothesis, it's more a kind of religious experience, responding to an experience.
We have time for 2 questions, and why don't you go ahead, sir?
Okay. I don't think the real problem is between science and religion. I think it's the way in which science is presented. And I wanted to focus on the theory of evolution. I took a geology class, and the first day the professor said, there are no such things as truth or facts in science. And yet the following lecture he said that evolution is a fact. There's no way getting around it. And I think that a theory is essentially science's best guess based on the information they have right now. And I'm wondering, do you think that, I mean, Darwin himself said that to suppose the eye was evolved out of natural selection is preposterous. So, I mean, Darwin had a problem with his own theory. Do you think that that there should be more presentation in terms of science as far as intelligent design in the classroom? Do you think that there should be more emphasis on creation, or do you think that should just be eliminated or not discussed?
Okay, I guess I can address that since I teach in biology classes. Somebody, one of the questioners, sort of accused me of using the God of the gaps argument, which I wasn't trying to do in my argument, but it was sort of trying to address this idea that has been presented by Richard Dawkins and other noted speakers of what's called the neo-Darwinian synthesis, which says it is a fact that all change that has led to organisms from the very first piece of nucleic acid up to human beings has come across as a result of simple, gradual, one-by-one changes in DNA sequence that are selected for by the environment. There aren't even any other naturalistic explanations that you can give to supplement that. This is the only way that it happens. And he and others present this. This is an absolute fact. This is not a theory. And so that is what was trying to argue, that a real scientist is not going to be that certain of some particular process, especially something that has presumably happened in ages past that we can't directly look at, we see by inference, as being the absolute fact, that you have to be open. Maybe this isn't exactly right. Maybe the real answer is totally different, and I just haven't had all the facts. And so what I try to do in the classroom is to present the idea that we have a number of theories. There are other theories, as you might call it, of evolution. There's what's called neutral genetic drift that goes in direct conflict with neo-Darwinian synthesis, and more people are actually leaning this direction, although for political reasons you don't hear that. It isn't taught in the classrooms, but that is just another naturalistic theory that's in conflict with the current theory that's in favor. And so what I tell students to do is to look critically at the theory that's presented, look at the evidence, go back and read some of the papers that the textbook references and see if it really supports what the textbook says, rather than teaching this is the way that it happened. And I think that is more important than just telling someone that it is a fact that you were created or is a fact that you evolved. But you have a mind, look at it critically yourself. Don't just accept what is presented, and you have to make up your own decisions. But dialogue with other people who have different ideas, and ask them, support your ideas, and learn why you believe what you believe. So that's my approach.
Thank you.
Last question over here.
Hi. I'd just like to thank you all first for coming out here. It's been great, and just wanted to share that I think that it's great that you all are representing Christians who think about these things, and showing everybody that you do have a brain and that you don't just read the Bible and believe it and go on with your life, and you do think about these things. And this question is for the biology professor.
Hot seat.
Lucky Doug.
From the knowledge that you have, do you see more evidence for humans coming from apes or not? And also any personal opinions or hypotheses?
Okay, that's always the big question when evolution is discussed. People don't seem to worry so much about, well, there may have been some amoeba somewhere in my background, but am I a evolved ape, basically? And there is certainly a lot of study going on in this because everyone is interested, because it's a personal matter, as you might describe it. And how trying to decide, well, how did we get the things that make us human, and how are we different from the apes that are alive today? And with the Human Genome Project, and they now are working on a chimpanzee genome project, which I believe is close to being completed. And we already know that in terms of the DNA sequence, that list of nucleotide bases, that it's a very, very small difference that distinguishes us from apes, monkeys, chimpanzees, gorillas. And So what is there that really makes us human? And there's a lot of research into looking archaeology and paleontology, trying to identify who might be our ancestors, if there is such a link. And one of the things that when I look at the various things that are published on this, they show these trees that show various branches that are thought to somewhere along the line have given rise to modern humans. And first of all, everyone has a different tree. There are probably 20 or 30 of them out there in published literature. And it's not that it's becoming more simple as more and more fossils are being discovered showing slightly different organisms that look somewhat like humans and perhaps somewhat like apes. But you end up with basically just a bunch of branches that you don't really know how they're connected. And so it makes it very difficult, and I would say probably impossible to draw a direct line going between these different organisms. And I don't have any trouble imagining that there are, have been in the past, different groups of what are basically animals that look very much like humans and perhaps have some cognitive abilities. But this idea of being made in the image of God is something beyond just cognitive ability or appearance of being able to walk upright, some of these other traits. And it's something in this notion of being able to, we all have this idea of right and wrong. And what does that mean in terms of some naturalistic evolutionary process? There's something that's gone on that's beyond our understanding but distinguishes us from what we recognize as being the animal world. So the short answer of that is I don't think the biology community agrees on any definitive path to explain a link between humans and apes. That certainly we share a lot in common genetically, and whether God did by some special act of creation just taking the model of an ape's genetics, assemble a human being, or by some means modified an existing organism to give our physical being, I don't know the answer to that. And we've already discussed whether Genesis, in the interpretation of it, really tells you for certain. It says that we were made out of the dust of the earth. And certainly that is the case. Our basic constituents are the materials that are found on the dust of the earth. But did God, as a potter, a literal, like a human potter, sort of mix that with some mud and formed a human being, and through some magical process made it a human being as we are ourselves? Or perhaps using something akin to the genetic engineering that we're now using, except at a much, much more advanced level that we can't even imagine, modified something that he'd already created through other processes and made it into something as miraculous as a human being.
The panelists have all agreed to stay afterwards for informal chat if you want to come up and talk with them. But right now it's time to bring the formal part of the program to a close. And so please join me in thanking the panelists for this evening's presentation.
For more information about the Veritas Forum, including additional recordings and a calendar of upcoming events, please visit our website at www.veritas.org.